Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today I've got this month's patron pick. That means that this topic was suggested and voted for by my supporters on Patreon. Thanks so much to all of you, I really appreciate it. And it kind of strikes me as a little bit surprising that I was able to get almost 300 episodes in without doing a single one about Trinisphere. We're definitely going to be making up for some lost time today because this is going to be all the questions about Trinisphere. Ready? Let's get started. So before I start talking about how Trinisphere works in general, I want to talk a little bit about how paying costs work. And there is a specific section in the comprehensive rules where there's all the steps that you need to do in order to cast a spell. And within that, there's a specific step that talks about what you need to do in order to determine the cost to cast that spell. Of course, we know that usually when you're going to play a spell, that usually involves paying some kind of cost. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that there's a specific procedure to decide what that cost would be. And so this is the relevant part of the comprehensive rules. I pulled it out for anyone who's interested in reading it. But, well, you know, I think the bullet points really brings the point out a little bit more accessibly, let's say. So in order to decide how much a spell costs, what you're going to do is follow these steps in order. And it's kind of like layers. It's not exactly like the layers that you would see in continuous effects, and that's not a technical rules term. That's kind of more of an analogy. But I think it's a really good analogy because there are these steps, and anything that happens in any of these steps is going to only apply in that step, regardless of what order stuff came into play or what order they started or how they apply. So what you're going to do is start with the basic cost, and that's going to be the mana cost or the alternate cost, whichever is appropriate to how you're playing that spell. And then after that, you apply any cost increasers, including stuff that's an additional cost. And then after that, you apply any cost reducers. And after all of that, you apply any cost setters, which for now is only Trinisphere. So that means that Trinisphere is one of those special cards that's in the club of things that have a rule specifically devoted to determining how it works. So let's get to some concrete examples because I think that's going to really help make this make a lot more sense. So this is my first one. We're going to say that we're casting a lightning bolt, and of course lightning bolt normally costs 1 red mana to play, right? So we've got Sphere of Resistance in play and we got Ruby Medallion in play, and based on what we saw on that last slide, we're going to apply the cost increasing from Sphere of Resistance first, and then after that we're going to apply the cost reducing from Ruby Medallion. And this example kind of gives us an idea of why there's layers for this at all and what the purpose of that is. If there was some sort of way for Ruby Medallion to apply first and Sphere of Resistance to apply second, well, then it would really be in kind of an awkward situation because the Ruby Medallion wouldn't really be doing anything because it would be trying to reduce the cost to less than there is available, and then the Sphere of Resistance would increase the cost afterwards. So that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so that's why cost increasers always go first and cost decreasers always go afterwards. So it doesn't matter what order these two came into play. The end result is that the lightning bolt is always going to cost a single red mana to cast, which is how it always would normally work. So that's kind of a warm up to help get everybody excited for some of the stuff that's going to be coming up. Okay, so here's one where we actually involve Trinisphere. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play a Vines of Astwood, and we're going to have a Trinisphere in play. So how much would that cost? And of course, we're using the kicker cost in order to do that. So kicker is, as you can see from the reminder text here, an additional cost that is going to be applied to the Vines of Astwood. So as we saw on the slide with the bullet points, and feel free to refer back to that one at any time. Of course, this being a video, that's something you should be able to do. But with the Vines of Astwood being an additional cost, that is going to apply earlier than Trinisphere because the Trinisphere layer is at the very, very end. And so what that means is it doesn't matter whether you kick this or not, you're going to end up paying 3 mana either way. So if you were to not kick it, then you would start at a base cost of green, and then there wouldn't be any additional costs, and then you would apply Trinisphere, so you'd end up paying 2 mana and then a green. Whereas if you were going to kick it, then you would be starting off with the base cost of green, and then there would be an additional cost of green, and then Trinisphere will be like, well, hold up, we're still not quite there yet, so it'll add an additional 1 on that, so it'll be 1 and a green and a green. So that's how Trinisphere would work here. You can see that in this specific case, there's really no downside to kicking it because you're going to have to pay 3 mana either way. So you might as well at least pay a second green in order to get a little bit of extra value out of there. So this is another one of my kind of favorite examples for how this sort of stuff works. We're going to say that we have this Frogmite, right? and we have lots and lots of artifacts, like 20 or 30, maybe some treasure tokens or something. I don't know how we got that many artifacts, but let's say we have lots and lots and lots of artifacts. So how much would we be paying for the Frogmite? Well, again, what you're going to do is you're going to start with the base cost, which in this case would be 4, and then we apply the cost reducers, and the cost reducers, of course, would get us down to 0. If you read that whole giant paragraph that I had at the very beginning, there was a line in there that said, if you try to reduce the cost to below 0, that's not going to work. 0 is the lowest you can go to. So when we apply the affinity for artifacts, which is the cost reducer, we're not going to go to like negative 100 or something. It's just going to go down to 0. So after that, because Trinisphere applies after the cost reducers and after the cost increasers both, the Trinisphere is going to say, well, 0 would be less than 3. And so as a result of that, what you're going to see is the Trinisphere is going to bring it back up to 3. And even if we have more artifacts that could be reducing the cost, the time when cost reducing stuff has already happened. And so that means that we're actually going to be paying 3 mana. And so this is where like the kind of conventional wisdom of Trinisphere always wins, that's where that kind of came up from. Because you could see that in both of these last couple of examples, the Trinisphere did win, and then it would end up costing 3. Here's another kind of example that's a real classic one. So of course, if we're going to play the Force of Will for its sucker cost of 3 and 2 blue, the Trinisphere is not going to care at all about that. As well, 5. Oh boy, you must be a high roller, and it's going to walk away. You're not going to have any extra mana from Trinisphere then, of course. On the other hand, if you were going to play the Trinisphere, if you were going to play the Force of Will, rather, for its alternate cost of paying 1 life and exiling the blue card, well, then the Trinisphere is going to say, well, we're going to start with the base cost, and the base cost in this case would be paying 1 life and exiling the blue card. And then there's not going to be any reducers or increasers or anything. It's just going to go straight to the Trinisphere layer, and it's going to, hey, wait a minute, that's less than 3. So then your cost to play the Force of Will would be 3 mana and paying 1 life and exiling a blue card. So you're getting a lot less good of a deal. But yeah, the Trinisphere also does apply to alternate costs as well, such as what the Force of Will has. Now here's some stuff that it does not apply to. So for example, if you had something like a Renewed Faith and you were going to cycle that, if you look at how cycling is worded, you can see that there's a colon in the cycling, and that indicates that the cycling is actually not casting a spell. What we're actually doing is activating an ability. And so because we're activating an activated ability, which is in the game terms completely different and not related to casting a spell, the Trinisphere is going to see you do that and be like, okay, that's fine. So there's not going to be any additional mana associated with that. You would still be paying 1 and a white in order to cycle the Renewed Faith. And of course, the triggered ability that happens when you cycle Renewed Faith, that is also going to be the same sort of thing. It's be a triggered ability, not casting a spell at all, and so that means that you're going to gain the 2 life without having to pay any extra mana into that. Now this is one that you're going to want to be careful on. You got to read the cards very closely because in some cases it'll look like it's going to be casting a spell, but it's actually activating an ability. But in other cases, it'll actually be casting the spell. So you want to really look at the Oracle text and look at the comprehensive rules entry for any of the keywords that are associated to know whether what you're trying to do is casting a spell or activating an ability. And of course, for a lot of game purposes, that doesn't matter, but for the Trinisphere, it definitely does. So, be careful when you're applying this ruling because it might or might not be applicable to any other related types of keywords. So for example, flashback, if you're flashing something back from the graveyard, that actually does involve playing the spell. So your flashback cost that you're paying to do that would indeed be affected by the Trinisphere in that case. However, with Renewed Faith, because we're not casting a spell, we're not going to have any of that kind of issue. So, okay, next example would be Ward. And so if you look at what Ward says, it says when this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls. Then you would counter that spell or ability unless the player pays 1. So let's carefully consider that. If we were going to play like a Lightning Bolt, for example, on the Burly Breaker, what would happen? And so first, we're going to have to go through the process of casting a spell, in this case, casting the Lightning Bolt. So we're going to say, okay, the cost is red, And then after that, we're going to increase the cost to 3 because of Trinisphere. And then, okay, now that we're through that, we finally cast the lightning bolt, right? So now we're going to come up with phase 2, which is the ward triggered ability is going to trigger when Burly Breaker became the target of that lightning bolt. And so now you're also going to have to pay 1 more for ward. So it actually does not count towards the Trinisphere at all. The ward triggered ability doesn't even trigger until after the Trinisphere is already applied. But again, because this is paying into a triggered ability, it's not casting a spell. So the Trinisphere is not going to make it so the ward is also 3. So for this case, what would happen is you would have to pay 2 and a red in order to cast the lightning bolt. And then after that, you'd have to pay 1 additional in order to keep the lightning bolt from getting countered. So that's how that situation would work. Okay, so and now we're ready for some, kind of maybe I'll call this one intermediate. The stuff we were talking about before, that's all related to, the kind of umbrella of how does Trinisphere work in general, and what counts and what doesn't count, so to speak. So with this, we're getting into a little bit more, kind of interesting cases, I'm going to call it, and that's going to be some special mana symbols. So X is our first special mana symbol. Now, in the process of casting a spell, you actually have another step, and it's before the step where you decide how much mana the spell costs. That step is going to be where you declare the value for X. So if you were going to cast a Blaze, what would actually happen is you're going to say how much mana you're intending to pay into the X, and then you're going to choose the targets, and that happens in that same kind of step. And then afterwards, the game is going to see, okay, so let's say we're playing it with X equals 1. So, okay, now that we chose X as 1, we're going to calculate how much mana it costs. So the base cost is going to be X and a red. So because we chose 1 for X, it's going to be 1 and a red. And then we're going to apply any cost increasers or any cost reducers, just like we always do. And then the Trinisphere layer is going to happen after that, and it'll be like, hey, wait a sec. We're only paying 2? Ooh, no. So then it's going to increase that up to 3. So if you had X as 2 or any bigger number, then when Trinisphere did that check, it would not have any issues at all, because you would be paying 3 or more. But if you're choosing X as 1 with this Blaze with the Trinisphere out, that might be kind of an issue because, well, you're not going to be paying enough mana according to the Trinisphere. So you would be having to pay some extra. So in this case, it doesn't really make sense to Blaze for any number less than 2 if there's a Trinisphere out, under most circumstances. So, okay, let's see. The next one is going to be the hybrid mana symbols. So I'm very sad. There are not actually any Magic cards in history whose use of the 2 and a blue, for example, hybrid mana symbol that you see like in the Reaper King and some other cards. None of the cards that use the 2 or a color mana symbol have a mana cost that's low enough that it would go underneath the Trinisphere depending on your choice. They all cost 3 no matter what you're choosing for those mana. So unfortunately, I didn't bring any of those in. We have the Turn to Mist, and that's a little bit less exciting because the Turn to Mist is going to be costing 2 and then whatever color you're choosing either way with the Trinisphere out. But I did want to talk about these because maybe in the future sometime they're going to print some cards where this is going to come up. And the idea here is the choosing which thing you're going to pick to pay for the hybrid mana symbol. That also happens. It's about the same time in the casting a spell when you're deciding what the X is going to be. But that also happens before the time when you're actually paying the cost, or even before where you're figuring out how much the cost is going to be. So if you have a hybrid mana symbol, that is indeed going to be before the Trinisphere applies, choosing that one. Now here's one that definitely does make a difference, and that's going to be our friend Dismember here. So with the Dismember, we have Phyrexian mana symbols, and of course that can be paid with either a black mana or with 2 life. And so this is going to be the exact same thing as what we said with the hybrid mana symbols, which is immediately in that same process where we're trying to decide what the non-hybrid equivalent that we're going to pay for the hybrid mana symbols is, we're also going to have in that same step, it's going to be asking us, okay, so with this black mana, Phyrexian symbol, are we going to be paying a black or are we going to be paying 2 life? And again, that happens before Trinisphere applies, and it happens in an earlier step in the casting a spell process than the determining how much the spell costs. So what would happen in this case is you're casting Dismember. The game is going to ask you what you're going to be paying for its cost, whether that's going to be 1 black black or 1 black and 2 life, or maybe 1 and 4 life. The game is going to ask you which of those you want. And then you're going to have to pick the target. And then we're going to go through the how much mana is this spell going to cost step. So in that case, if you chose 1 and a black for how we're going to pay the Dismember, that's good. That's 3. So Trinisphere is okay with that. If you chose 1 and a black and 2 life, then Trinisphere is going to say, okay, well now we're only paying 2, so it's going to make you pay 2 and a black and 4 life, and 2 life. And then of course, if you paid 4 life into the Phyrexian mana symbols, then it's going to be only 1, so you'd have to be paying 3 colorless and 4 life. So again, if you have the colored available, it doesn't really make sense to pay any life when there's the Trinisphere out. So that's how that one would work. Now we're going to get, and this is where I say is kind of like more advanced stuff. And this is where things get really fun, in my opinion. So with Delve and Convoke and Improvise, actually all 3 of these mechanics function exactly the same way. So if you have any like rules questions that involve one of those mechanics, you're generally going to be able to apply the answer to any question involving the other 2, and it's going to work basically the same way. So with this, you can see we've got the Treasure Cruise. And the way that Delve, Improvise, and Convoke all work is a little bit different from what you might expect. And actually, they did used to work differently, but they actually changed how the rules work, and I'm not really sure I remember what the impetus was behind that change. But the way that these abilities, all 3 of them, work now is if you have a cost that you're going to pay in order to cast this spell, then the Delve is going to make it so that, well, any colorless or any generic mana that's in that cost, you could, pay mana for it, or you could exile a card out of your graveyard. Now, at first you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between that and, the Phyrexian mana, for example, that we had before, or the hybrid mana, where we have a choice in how to pay that. And the difference is that this choice is actually going to act on how we pay that cost. There isn't a specific step in the process of casting the spell where we have to say what we're going to be doing, and then what the base cost for the spell is based on those decisions. No, what's actually going to happen is we're going to play the Treasure Cruise, and we're going to see how much mana it's going to cost to cast this spell, and it's going to be 7 and a blue. And then there's not going to be any cost increasers, and there's not going to be any cost reducers. And so we get to the Trinisphere step, and Trinisphere is going to be like, okay, 8 mana, no problem. And then we get to the step after Trinisphere, which is where we actually have to pay the cost. And because we're paying this cost of a card that has Delve, any mana that's colorless mana or generic mana in this cost is going to be payable by either the normal boring paying mana out of your mana pool, or the exciting new exiling cards out of your graveyard. So because of that, the Trinisphere doesn't see that we're going to be like taking a shortcut on the mana cost for this. When the game is trying to see how much the cost to cast the spell is, it's going to see, oh, we're paying 8 mana. But when we get to the step where we're actually going to pay that mana, Delve is going to say, hey, if you don't have enough mana, that's cool. You could just exile out of your graveyard some. And so because of that, it is definitely possible to say that we're playing the Treasure Cruise, exile 7 cards out of our graveyard, and tap 1 island, and the Trinisphere is not going to be able to say anything about that. It's going to be no problem. No, it's just a normal 8 mana spell as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. That's a little bit different from how most people would probably think that that would work. So yeah, all three of these abilities can in fact get around how Trinisphere would work. So that's pretty nice. Now here's another one. If you've never heard of Improvise, they've only done it in one block so far, but it's kind of a fun mechanic. So Improvise means it's basically like Convoke, except your artifacts are what you're tapping in order to help pay for your cost. So we'll say that we have this inspiring statuary out, and also a Trinisphere. So I'm going to control both of those, and maybe I want to play some spell, some non-artifact spell that costs, we'll say 3 for fun, for the purposes of this question. It's going to cost 3 mana. And it's a non-artifact spell, so it has Improvise. And so what we want to do is we want to tap the Trinisphere and the Inspiring Statuary, and that's going to, pay for our spell. So what do you think? Can we do that? And then, of course, we would have to pay like one additional normal mana in order to do that. So a couple of really interesting things to point out here. First of all, Improvise works exactly the same way as what Convoke and Delve do. So from that being the case, we can see that the Trinisphere is going to be, it's going to see, oh, we're casting a 3 mana spell, no problem at all, and then we're going to tap some stuff, and then we're going to be able to. So yes, we would be able to play a 3 mana spell by tapping Inspiring Statuary and Trinisphere and tapping 1 land. The really interesting question is, could we play a 2 mana spell for free by tapping just the Inspiring Statuary and the Trinisphere? And so the reason that you might think that that might even be possible is if you look at what Trinisphere says, and it says as long as Trinisphere is untapped. So that's that's kind of interesting. A lot of people don't catch that because it's not going to be tapped very often. The reason that they did this, by the way, is because the Darksteel was in Maraudin block, and that's like an artifact throwback block. So the way artifacts used to work was that they would be turned off if they were tapped. And so that's the reason if you ever see like a Howling Mine, like an old Howling Mine, it doesn't say the phrase as long as Howling Mine is untapped on it. It'll just say each player draws an extra card, and that's the end of it. So as kind of an homage to how artifacts used to work, they made it so Trinisphere does the same thing. So the idea, of course, would be that we're going to tap the Trinisphere, and so therefore its ability isn't going to apply, and it's not going to make our 2 mana spell cost 3 mana. So let's see how that would work. So we're going to start with the base cost, which we said was 2. And then we're going to apply any cost increasers and any cost reducers, which in this case there are none. And then we're going to apply Trinisphere. So Trinisphere is going to apply and make the cost be 3. And then after that, we're going to pay the cost. And so remember that Improvise is like Delve and Convoke, it acts on how we can pay the cost. And so what that means is that at this time, this is the time when we have an actual opportunity to tap Inspiring Statuary and Trinisphere in order to help us pay this cost. And it works just like Delve. Instead of exiling cards from your graveyard, you're tapping artifacts. But in any case, you can see that we've got a problem, which is that Trinisphere has already applied, and so that means it's too late to tap it to shut it off because we already had Trinisphere say that we're too cheap and we need to go up to 3 mana. So in fact, casting a 2 mana spell with Inspiring Statuary and a Trinisphere is going to look exactly the same as casting a 3 mana spell with Inspiring Statuary and Trinisphere, because the Trinisphere does not get tapped and therefore does not get shut off until after the point in the process of casting that spell where the Trinisphere has already looked at the mana and seen whether it's enough or not. So that's kind of a bummer. That's not the coolest thing that it possibly could be. But hey, that's life sometime. And that's it. That's pretty much all the Trinisphere questions. There's not really any other interesting Trinisphere questions out there at all. Oh geez. Yeah. I knew this one was coming. Of course, this wouldn't really be like a Trinisphere episode if I wasn't going to talk about Trinisphere and the Trinisphere card. So this one, of course, this question coming to us straight out of the Judge Vault with Kirk, the son of Yawgmoth. And so, of course, the idea here, obviously if you were going to play the Kirk, it costs like 4 at a minimum, and so even if you're paying like all 3 Phyrexian mana in the mana cost, we're not going to be super interesting there. But it looks like there might be some other abilities on this card, so maybe let's have a read through on that. Lifelink, okay, yeah, no problem. Whenever you cast a black spell, you get a +1/+1 counter. Okay, that's kind of cool. And then the middle ability, of course, is the one where everybody's already thinking about what's supposed to be going on. So for each black in a cost, you can pay 2 life rather than pay that mana. Now, of course, what you should be thinking about here is like, oh, that's kind of like the Phyrexian mana. It's like it basically makes all your mana into Phyrexian mana for your black stuff at least. So is that how it will work? Well, let's think about exactly how this is going to shake out and bring to bear a little bit about like what we've learned so far. So remember that when we had the Phyrexian mana, there was a specific step in the process of casting a spell, and it was before when we determined what the cost for the spell would be. It was before that step where we had to say, okay, so this Phyrexian mana symbol, I'm going to be paying 2 for that one. And this Phyrexian mana symbol, I'm going to be paying a black for that one. So the step where you have to say that is actually before the Trinisphere applies. And so that means that with the Phyrexian mana symbols, you're basically not getting a bargain with the Trinisphere, let's say. With Kirk, it's a little bit different. You can see that what Kirk says is for each black in a cost, you can pay 2 life rather than paying that mana. And so that is worded the same way as how Delve, Convoke, and Improvise are, which means that what you're actually doing is you're looking at this cost, and instead of doing the normal thing that I do in order to pay that cost, we've got some extra options here that this ability is helping us out with. So it's going to work exactly the same way as with like the Treasure Cruise example, where we start out by looking at the cost, and Trinisphere is going to vet it to make sure it's 3 or 3 or more. And then after that, when we're actually paying the cost, we have to make some more decisions about whether we're going to be like paying mana for that stuff or whether we're going to exile some cards, or in this case, pay 2 life. So we're going to examine, let's say we were going to play the spell and it has a hypothetical mana cost of black, right? So 2 black mana is the mana cost of this spell that we want to cast. So we have Kirk and we have the Trinisphere out. What will happen? So with that, we're going to go through, and there's no interesting stuff that goes on in the process until the spot where we have to determine what the cost to cast the spell is. And there's no increasers and there's no reducers, there's just Trinisphere. And so Trinisphere is going to say, okay, our cost is going to be 1 and a black instead of just a black and a black, because that means it'll be 3. But after that happens, then it's going to come the time to actually pay that cost. And so because we have Kirk in play, what's going to happen is for each of those 2 black mana symbols in that cost, we can choose to pay 2 life rather than paying that mana. And so it would be totally possible for us to pay 1 mana and 2 black mana. But it would also be possible for us to pay 1 mana and 4 life, even though there's a Trinisphere out, because the Kirk works different from Phyrexian mana in that it lets you pay it, and it acts on the step where you're actually paying the cost rather than acting in the step immediately before by like changing the mana symbol into a Phyrexian mana symbol. So I don't know if any of you have ever played games on an emulator before, but you know that sometimes the emulator is kind of bugged. And so what you would normally get in an actual normal hardware, you get like some extra unintended kind of consequences. And this is what I like to think of that. The Kirk is doing his best to emulate Phyrexian mana, but it's bugged. The software doesn't check, doesn't give you the choice of whether you're paying 2 life or the actual mana at the same time. And so because of that, it works a little bit differently from how it normally would. So of course, for one last fun thing, I'd like to revisit our friend Dismember with the Kuruk in play. How would it look to cast the Dismember? So we start with a mana cost of 1 and a Phyrexian black and a Phyrexian black. And when we're making normal choices for the spell, we have to decide, we have to say, okay, for this Phyrexian mana symbol, I'm paying a black, and for this Phyrexian mana symbol, I'm paying 2 life. And let's do it that way, just for the sake of argument. You can talk about in the comments what the ramifications would be if we made some different choices there. But we'll say that for one of the Phyrexian symbols, we're going to make it 2 life, and for one of them, we're going to make it just a normal black mana. So with that being the case, the next important step in the process is going to be, we're going to decide, okay, how much mana is it going to cost to cast the spell? Or how much is it going to cost to cast the spell? So at this point, we're not going to have any cost reducers or cost increasers. We're just going to have Trinisphere. And Trinisphere is going to see, we're paying 1, and we're paying a black, and we're paying 2 life. And that is less than 3 mana. So I'm going to say we're paying 2 and a black and 2 life. And so after that, we're going to get to the part where we actually pay that cost, and that's where Kirk's ability is going to function. And so instead of paying the 1 remaining black mana in this cost, it would be possible for us to pay 2 life. So then we would be paying 2 normal mana and 4 life in order to cast this Dismember. So you can see that what you probably are going to want to do with the Kirk and the Dismember and the Trinisphere is when you first have the Phyrexian mana, because it's real life actual Phyrexian mana and Dismember's mana cost, you're going to say, okay, for both of these I'm paying black. Because then when you get to the step where Trinisphere is going to ask how much mana we're casting the spell with, it's going to be, oh, it's 3 mana, okay, no problems there. So then we get to the Kirk step where we're actually paying the cost, and it'll be 1 normal mana and 2 black mana, and Kirk is going to give us the choice of whether to pay an extra, pay the 2 life instead of either of those 2 manas. So that is probably the optimal way that you would want to cast that with this out. That doesn't like allow Trinisphere to infiltrate and put any extra mana into the mana cost there. But it is kind of weird to think that the Kirk is bugged in its emulation of Phyrexian mana, and it actually works a little bit differently from how normal Phyrexian mana would actually work if it was actual Phyrexian mana. So hopefully I did a good job explaining that. If not, ask any questions in the comments. That is actually all the questions that I had prepared today. One last thing before I close out. Thank you so much to all of my patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everybody who takes the time and spends money out of their actual paychecks to help support what I'm doing here. And if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, I have the link in the description below. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.